Hi, in this video we're going to talk about using the arithmetic operators and some kind of quirky things about arithmetic in C++. So I want to start out first by talking about some problems that you might have with mixing data types. And that will lead into one of our operator quirks here in a little bit. So I'm going to demonstrate this very simply. If I declare a variable as an integer and assign a whole number to it, then I can be sure that that value is going to stay as it is when I access the variable. So here I'm declaring number to be the value 1, and there's 1 when I write it out to the screen. Now, it turns out through a quirk in the language that I can assign a floating point value to a integer variable, which most languages won't let you do. But this language, C++ will let you do that. And when you do, you see what happens. There's data loss right there. We assigned 1.1, there's the 1.1, but what we got was 1, which is definitely some data loss. So there's a data loss when assigning a float to integer. Now, if you go the other way, there's not a data loss. So for example, I can say double num equal 2, and then we're going to see out num, and we still get 2. There's no data loss there. Okay, so when we have data loss, that's called a narrowing conversion, because we're going 1.0 to 1. I wrote narrowing. When we convert, or when we assign a integer value to a double, that's called a widening conversion. And so in this case we had 2, and that gets 2.0. So narrowing conversions are bad, and widening conversions are fine, although I would be careful about using them. So that's our first little lesson. Now let's move on. So we've already talked about, in the last chapter, the arithmetic operators: addition, subtraction, multiplication, division, and modulo. What I want to show you instead is what happens when we do some types of arithmetic. So I'm going to do this almost like using a scratch pad. You might think that the output of this is going to be 9, because it's going to add 1 to 2 and then multiply by 3. But as you'll see, when we run the code, it actually turns out to be 7. Excuse me. And that's because multiplication comes before division. So there's an order of operations, and the way to remember that is my dear Aunt Sally: multiplication, division, addition, subtraction. So for example, as long as I write the code like this, the multiplication step is always going to come before the addition step. We can modify that by putting parentheses around sub-expressions. So when the compiler sees parentheses, it clears that sub-expression first and then finishes the rest of the expression. So now we're going to get 9, because we're going to add 2 plus 1 to get 3, and then multiply that by 3. So be aware that there is an order of operations and that you can modify that by using parentheses. So the last thing I want to talk about in this video is integer division, because that's another important thing that I've kind of talked about. I think we talked about that in the last chapter, but I want to bring it up again. So when you see this, now let's do an odd one. Okay. The result of that is 3, because the integer I'm sorry, the division operator does integer division. So integer division, 11 divided by 3 is 3 with a remainder of 2. Okay, so what that means is that anytime you have division, if you want a floating point result, or you think there's a chance of a floating point result, then you need to make one part float. So if I change 11 to 11.0, now I'll get a floating point answer, 3.6667. Another way to do that, I believe we looked at that in the last chapter, was to do a static cast, where we temporarily convert one value to a double for the sake of the operation. That should give us the same result. There we go. So you need to be very careful about integer division in C++, and you need to watch how you mix assignments. Other languages don't let you do that. I'm sorry, other compiled languages don't let you do that, but C++ does, so you have to be careful. So that wraps up this video, and thanks a lot for paying attention.